Hello, everybody. I am Nicole DeShazo, and I'm a granddaughter of John and Leslie DeShazo, who were one of the pioneer families of the Forties. So out here in Trussville, we have an intersection at Valley Road and called 40 Road, and people say it's because of the moniker is from when slaves were given 40 acres and a mule, but that's not true for our area. It's actually when we were given 40 acres on the outskirts of the Cahaba project. So in the 1930s, the Forties was born out of the resettlement project when the tenants were moved from the furnace quarters. The poor whites were moved up to Roper Hill, and the blacks were moved to the 40 acres where it's now Pineview Road, DeShazo Drive, 40 Road, and Valley Road, and then part of Linden. There were 60 to 70 families that were displaced at that time, and it's also called Washington Heights. So if you're looking at your map book, you'll find it's called Washington Heights as well. So that's why we got the 40 Road for the 40s area. Pioneer families during that time were my grandparents, John and Leslie DeShazo, and because of where their home place was, we have DeShazo Drive. Then there's also a pioneer family, the Hammonds, and they have Hammond Drive or Hammond Road, which is at the end of Pineview. And it's kind of growing up. I think there's only one home there that is still from those. There are descendants of the Hammonds. And then you have the Crawfords, which are my grandparents' brother and first cousin. And Jesse Crawford was one of the men that helped create the spring when the blacks were moved up there, and they had to kind of walk down through somebody's backyard to go to the creek, but he helped create a spring, and they called it Jesse Spring. And that family's still thriving. They have moved outside of Trussville area, but they still live in Birmingham. The Washingtons are part of the pioneer families, and Ozzie Washington actually gave a portion of his land to the Mount Zion Church so they could establish their church setting. And I'll give you some history on Mount Zion in a minute. The Jacksons, the Herds, the Woods, the Crosses, and the Turners are also common names that their descendants still live up in the Forties area. And some of them still in the home places, the home structures that were given to their parents back in the 30s and 40s. Because the 40s wasn't incorporated in the Cahaba project, the tenants pretty much stayed separate in self-contained community, where the blacks built new cottages and rebuilt their lives apart from the model town. Let's see what the next slide is. Sorry. That right there, that's the school building behind Mount Joy Baptist Church at the top of Valley Road. That school was one of the school buildings for people that were probably reared in 37 through the 1950s and 60s. That was their schoolhouse building. And then in the, sorry about that. Here we go. Then in the 60s, it was in the 70s, it was used as a Head Start program. So people in my generation, we used it. That was our Head Start school before we came down to first grade, which is the building that we now have City Hall near. And then since then, after Head Start closed, the community purchased the building, and we now use it as our community center. And before Mount Joy actually built a kitchen, that was the kitchen that they used to fellowship in before Mount Joy built their second building. And the next, that is Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church. It is at the end of DeShazo Drive and Hammond Road. And it was built in 1916, and as I said before, Luther Washington donated the land And the first structure was, of course, just a wooden building, but now it's a two-story building, and it still has some pioneer descendants of the pioneer families that are lay leaders and trustees of that church. That's including the Turners, the Washingtons, and the Herds, and a couple of the Osborns. And that's Mount Joy Baptist Church. In 2027, we'll be celebrating 170 years in Trussville, and we actually have been found to be the oldest black church in Jefferson County. We're actually trying to prove that we're the oldest black church in Alabama, but we're kind of close to being able to make that evident that we're probably the oldest black church in Alabama that has had a black pastor for the entire time of the history of the church. There's mention of a cemetery that is more than 100 years, 160 years old, and we found out recently it's not exactly behind the church, but it's landlocked between some subdivisions in the community below the church behind Linden. And when we have our historical fair in October, I hope to be able to give more information on the churches and the cemetery so that y'all can see how vital it is to our Trussville history. Back in the 70s and 80s, the area for the blacks, we actually had 3 Baptist churches and a Methodist church, which pretty much were all ran by the different families. And as time went on and some of the churches had to close, New Bethel, we had to close in 1990. They joined in with the Mount Joy Baptist congregation, and then there's a church over in the area we call the Rockquarium Service Road, that was Mount Canaan Church. They join in with Mount Joy as well, so we pretty much have 3 churches in one now, and joining the families together, and then of course having people from outside of Birmingham in our membership now. So again, in 2027, we'll be celebrating 170 years up on the hill. I think that's about all, other than I'll give more history in October, more details, but just want to help everybody understand that the black history of Trussville is just as vital to the growth of Trussville and us learning how we were then and how we're going to move forward together in the future. Any questions?
So is Washington Heights named for the Washington that lived up there?
I'm not sure, but that's a good question to look into. I don't think it probably would be, because that was the name that was given right from the resettlement administration. But it could have been just from somebody that was in that administration, because I think that was the original name given during the resettlement project before they assigned the parcels to the families. So I'll look into that though.
I think it's interesting to note that Nicole's grandfather that she was mentioning earlier worked at the Trussville furnace.
Yeah, came here to work on the furnace, yes. And he actually ended up losing his sight in the 1970s, so my grandmother ended up being the breadwinner of the family and raising 13 children. So she cooked at a lot of places down here. The Bama Inn was one of them. Dairy Queen, I remember going to Dairy Queen and picking her up from work, and working with Mr. Slay them down there. And she actually was a nanny for one of the police chiefs at one time. But she was one of those, she was a cook and raising her children and running things since my grandfather lost his sight. So he was at home tending to the house, and she'd come make the money. All right, thanks for y'all's time. And now we'll have Gary give us some history on the Cahaba project.
Good job, Nicole.
Thank you.
That was good stuff.
All right.